Okay, here's what's ahead in this episode. It's part 2 of our series, The Other Days That Music Died. Back in the first installment of this series, we discussed the day that music died. That was penned by Don McLean. It talked about the plane crash that involved Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and Big Bopper. We talked about the 27 Club, iconic artists that died at the age of 27. Well, let's do a quick review because we are in the middle of our 5th collaboration. We started off with the Wrecking Crew, 40 hit songs by 40 different artists that members of the Wrecking Crew played on. Carole King and Jerry Goffin Songbook, rock history of the Brill Building. We did a 2-part series on the Funk Brothers, the Motown equivalent in some ways to the Wrecking Crew. And now this is our 2nd installment of The Other Days the Music Died.
Holy cow. Well, this is awesome. I've said this before, I'll say it again. I don't think I know of anybody else who is doing this, let's call it partner podcast format, where we record one conversation and the two of us do our own separate edits and release them as different episodes. I think that is probably unique on the internet at this moment. I hope people who are watching Our Mind on Music right now will go and check out Phil's tracks, check out our different takes on this same conversation.
As of now, I distribute exclusively on Spotify. Jeremy, what platforms do you release on?
So currently the video version of Our Mind on Music is on YouTube, which I'll say exclusively. Currently that is true. And the audio version of Our Mind on Music is released on the Stage Dive streaming platform. Stage Dive is an amazing platform that recently started up. I've spoken to John Bruce, who is one of the founders of Stage Dive. I've talked to him 3 times on Our Mind on Music about trying to create a fair platform for musicians and creators like us to share our music or podcasts with audiences, and people pay a subscription to listen to things on there. And this is the crazy part in today's market. 50% of the subscription income goes to the artists that create the content. So that's why I post there, because I think they're building a model for the future of a sustainable music and entertainment business.
I got to commend you on your interview that was just recently published by Interlude magazine. You know, over the last year, you and I have communicated dozens of times, and while I know some of your music-related activities, candidly, I had no idea of the depth. Taking your mission of connecting people via music from Canada to Ecuador to Venezuela to China, I think I got that right, maybe not in the right sequence. Classical music, jazz, rock, strings, guitar, you're multi-talented. I just wanted to make sure that I start off this episode by saying thanks for all you do for everyone. Thanks for collaborating with me. I seriously recommend you check it out.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate that. I was really thrilled. I interviewed the cellist and author Janet Horvath a while ago on Our Mind on Music. In the context of our conversation, we were talking about music, and she was asking me about some of that stuff. After we had spoken, I'm not sure how long after, she contacted me and asked if I would be interested in doing an interview for Interlude magazine in Hong Kong. And I was really honored. I mean, for those who do take the time to check out Interlude, it's an amazing magazine dedicated to sharing really interesting insights into classical music. So for me to be included in that, just the fact of having my name in there, much less an article, was really exciting for me, and I really appreciated it.
It's very informative. It's a great read. Make sure you check that out. And for this episode, we wanted to continue on with some additional artists. For music fans, is there any other artist with a more recognizable nickname than Elvis Presley and the King? Elvis had an incredible music career, 18 #1 hits from I guess it was the mid-50s to the early 60s, iconic performances on the Ed Sullivan Show. He was in 30-some movies, I think, something like that. He was just an icon for the transition of music. It was moving. Elvis represented it, the gospel roots, the blues roots, and kind of melded it into this whole thing that started to become rock and roll. Clearly one of the most iconic cultural figures that influenced fashion and youth. Um, Jeremy, what are your thoughts about this dude called Elvis Presley?
You know I can be found sitting home all alone. If you can't come around, please telephone. Don't be cruel.
Elvis Presley, I mean, what can you say? It's the king of rock and roll. And as much as we talk about the king of this or the queen of this, I mean, as far as I know, the first time that term was ever used in this way was Elvis. You know, he was originator of this idea. Born January 8th, 1935, and he sadly died quite young in 1977, August 16th, 1977. It's not just about rock and roll. It was fashion, it was the attitude, it was, a whole outlook, really. So for a generation plus, he was the man, and then even now, years after his passing, he is an iconic figure. I can show his picture to my kids, 14 and 17 years old, and they don't pause for a second. They know exactly who that is. I will say there is a connection to Elvis and the Brill Building. We talked about the Brill Building before. Lieber and Stoller wrote at least two of Elvis's huge hits. Hound. The fact that he died quite young, very suddenly, I think had an impact on. He's probably like the quintessential example of having an impact far beyond his fan base. This had an impact on media in general, I would say.
It was interesting because I wasn't really an Elvis fan. I had a buddy that was a huge Elvis fan. In fact, he's the one that called me the day he died.
Wow.
I remember that. And he was mid-50s and early 60s. He had that string of hits. He spent some time in the service and kind of came back and did some movies and never really recaptured the magic. I mean, he still had it, but he obviously had his struggles. And I think part of what lends to the legacy of Elvis was his shocking death. His decline physically was well known in the public. His shows in Vegas, some of the video I watched, it was a struggle just to even to watch him perform.
Thank you very much, man.
And of course, he had that iconic comeback special. The Wrecking Crew played on that, I think, didn't they?
I believe so. At least members of it, yeah.
So he had a little bit of a brief comeback in the late 60s. I think it was 68. As far as the day he died, I did get the phone call from my friend. I posted on Facebook, my Facebook page, Jeremy, and I asked, do you remember where you were when Elvis died? And two common things came out. One, the respondents found out from their parents, which was interesting. And the other comment that I agreed with was, I didn't know how many Elvis fans were out there until he died.
Here on Elvis Presley Boulevard in Memphis. Thousands of fans from all over the country are converging on Graceland, trying to get in to
that
view the
incredible outpouring from people that you wouldn't think, and they were just absolutely devastated by the news of his death.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. I was really young when Elvis died, but my mom was and is a huge Elvis fan. I mean, literally in her car, she has an Elvis cushion on the seat that sits in place of honor. She has pictures of him and Tupelo written on it. So I grew up knowing Elvis's music and hearing it a lot. His Christmas album, I personally think the best Christmas song ever released was Santa Claus is Back in Town by Elvis.
I did an episode on Phil's Tracks of that Christmas album by Elvis and asked Phil's Tracks luminaries to contribute their favorite Christmas song. And I think you're on that. I may be wrong, but I think you got a contribution on that.
If I had a chance to talk about Santa Claus is Back in Town, I did.
Well, Elvis, there's so many things associated with Elvis. 132 gold album certifications, 80 weeks at #1 on the singles chart, 18 #1 hits. In preparation for this, one of the things that I found out I didn't know his hair color is actually blonde. Can you imagine? The whole image of Elvis is just so much different, right? If he kept to his natural color. And you thought what we could do is throw out a couple trivia questions now, and we'll give them the answer at the end of the episode. Yep. So here we go. There's 2. Elvis had 18 #1 hits. What #1 hit was his best selling single? Of all those 18 hits, which one sold the most singles? And the second, and I didn't know this, but he starred in 31 films. What was the highest grossing movie? So those are the 2 trivia questions. We will give you the answers at the end of this episode. The second king, I didn't know was a king. I'm going to be transparent. I always referred to him as the Prince of Pop. Found out, no, he's really the King of Pop. And of course, we're talking about Michael Jackson, dubbed the King of Pop.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 1989 Heritage Award and Sammy Davis Jr. Award recipient, and in my estimation, the true king of pop, rock, and soul, Mr. Michael Jackson. I love you. Thank you very much.
Hey, when I was growing up, it was Donnie Osmond and Michael Jackson with their family groups that hit the music scene about the same time. And there was a rivalry between the 2 groups. And there was always this ongoing debate. Who's better, the Jacksons or the Osmonds? Who's going to be a bigger star? Who's a better vocalist? The Jackson 5, boy, they came right out of the gate. They had 4 #1 hits in 1970. 4 #1 hits. Then Michael kind of pursued his solo career. That was in the early 70s, I think 72 or so. And then I don't want to say he disappeared, but clearly wasn't as famous. And then all of a sudden, there was this album called Thriller that came out, put him on a whole new pedestal.
We can't really jump straight to Thriller, I think, without mentioning Off the Wall, 1979, Rock With You. That album has, over time, it was a huge hit, but over time has become iconic for the production, for the players on it. Obviously, Quincy Jones, who we talked about in our last episode together, producing all of this, great stories from the recording sessions of Quincy Jones showing why he was the producer. So I just think to jump over Off the Wall would be doing a disservice historically.
That's a fair point. And then he was in the middle of this comeback tour, as I recall, the This Is It tour, and he died. Shockingly, he died. I think it was more of a shock, Jeremy, that he died than when Elvis died. Do you recall the day Michael died?
Yes. I'm pondering what you just said about it was more of a shock with Michael Jackson. And I think that is a really interesting statement because, as you mentioned, like we watched Elvis, he had gained a lot of weight. His health was clearly declining. So it was very sad and shocking that such a young man, such an iconic person, had passed away so young. With Michael Jackson, on the other hand, he was one of those situations, and we talked about this a little bit in the last episode about some of the artists who died at times that were really unexpected. For me, one of those was Chris Cornell, originally of Soundgarden. I thought, this guy's gotten past all of those things, all of those excesses, all of those demons, and he's made it, and then he died. Michael Jackson, you know, it was kind of the same thing. He had lots of controversies in his life. He had lots of challenges, obviously. And he was on a comeback tour. And we thought this was his, you know, crowning moment. Pardon the pun.
Very good. Crowning moment for the king of pop. I love that.
There you go. Holy, I'm a walking soundbite. But seriously though, like for I think a lot of people, we thought, oh, I can't believe it. He's making this wonderful comeback. And then suddenly we hear the news that he's died. And it was a huge shock. I mean, it was one of the cases where I remember people, you know, fans of his, or just people who had known about him their whole lives or most of their lives, just breaking into tears just at the mention of it. Did you hear Michael Jackson passed away? What? Shock, you know? It was one of those ones that really hit hard for a lot of people, again, beyond his fan base. You know, my mom, I mentioned earlier, was an Elvis fan. She wasn't a huge Michael Jackson fan by any stretch of the imagination, but it impacted her when he died. He was somebody that she had known for all of these years, from watching him grow up with his brothers, making those songs. And I think maybe that's part of it too. Suddenly, this guy who you've always known about his whole life, he was on in front of a camera, and then he's gone. It's just sudden and permanent.
The one thing as I look back on it was, even though maybe musically he had his ups and downs, he was always in the news. A lot of times not for the right reason, but he was always, it seemed to be in the limelight for some reason. I mean, musically, I'm just going to give a couple real quick highlights. Jeremy, you're the one I believe compiled this. 13 #1 singles, the best-selling album of all time. Of course, that was Thriller. Over 500 million records sold. 13 Grammy Awards. 8 in just one night. Of course, that was associated with Thriller. The Moonwalk Dance, perhaps the most iconic moment ever on the Grammys, isn't it?
Absolutely. Again, the internet is a funny place, because now everybody goes back and says, well, there was a guy who did the moonwalk back in the 30s. And okay, we know that now because we have the internet, but we didn't know that at the time. When he did that dance, we just, what is this? Like, we were in shock. What is he doing? It was amazing. You know?
I don't know what year he collaborated with Paul McCartney. I think
they did 2 songs. Okay. The Girl Is Mine is one, but they did 2 songs. Say, Say, Say was the big.
Say, Say, Say. Okay.
Yeah.
The reason I bring that up is that Michael purchased the rights to 251 Beatles songs. And the reason he did it was based on the conversation he had with Paul McCartney while they were working on those songs, when Paul educated him about publishing rights or something, and Michael used that information to outbid Paul McCartney for the rights to the Beatles songs. And that was kind of the end of the relationship between Michael and Paul. But this is a celebration of Michael, an incredible career of music, a lifetime of memories for many of us. He died June the 25th in 2009. He was 50 years old, as I recall. I know it was a Thursday, and I know I was listening to, of all things, a sports talk, AM sports talk, and the guy broke in, and I'll never forget it. It seemed weird to me. And he goes, we have a report from TMZ, and we can trust TMZ, he said. If TMZ says it's right, it's right. And at that time, he talked about the death of one Michael Jackson. Of course, it was hysteria, not only immediately surrounding the day of his death, but, you know, the funeral, the outcry, the physician who administered propofol, I think that's it. He ultimately was found guilty and served time in prison. I think he may be still serving time in prison, as far as I know.
If you wanted any proof that the death of Michael Jackson at 50 is a major international news story, then look no further than Times Square, where I'm now surrounded by people from this city, from all corners of the United States, and indeed holidaymakers here from around the world, who have come here to look up at the huge television screens that they have in Times Square and telling the news that Michael Jackson is dead.
Stunned right now. I love Michael Jackson.
He was such a big impact on my life. His dances, his dance routines, his lyrics were so incredible. He was such a serious act. I truly love Michael Jackson.
We are from Turkey and we know him. In our media he is shown every day and it's something written about him. And now we heard and we are sorry for him.
Actually, my grade 7 music class this semester they choose their own music that they're going to perform in class, and they chose Beat It from Thriller. These are 12-year-old kids. Beat It would be a great one to include just as a little nod to my students. And for me, I think Rock With You, I love the stories behind that song of how it was created in the studio, and it's a great song.
Quincy just looks at me and he goes, "You guys just aren't getting it." He goes, "JR, can you come up with a drum fill in the beginning of this song that the whole world will forever identify and recognize this song once they hear your drum fill?" And no problem.
Princess. Not a recording artist, not a singer. No, a real live princess, and that, of course, is Princess Diana. The deaths of Elvis and Michael, I know in my lifetime they were memorable, but they, in my opinion, they pale in comparison to the tragic death and the resulting outcry of emotion that took place associated with the tragic death of Princess Diana. Of course, that was back in 1997. Jeremy, what do you remember about Princess Diana's death and the week that followed?
Yeah, it's interesting for me. I was at that point living in Ecuador. I was teaching there. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with a flatmate, and we didn't have a television. We had basically a couch, 2 beds. That was it. One of those shortly after college type things. The lady who lived upstairs in this flat where we lived in Ecuador, in Quito, she came down, and I didn't speak very much Spanish at that point. And she came down, and the best she could, she tried to call us to go up to her apartment. And she was kind of frantic, and we were really scared. We were like, what is this? What's going on here? This older lady takes us up to the apartment, and there's a news report that Princess Diana has died. And they're showing it on the television. And this lady is quite emotional. And she didn't want us to miss that moment, knowing that we didn't have a TV, So this is in Ecuador. I'll never forget how moved this elderly Ecuadorian lady was, and the fact that she came down frantically getting us to go out and see the report, Just a few days later, 6 days later, Mother Teresa died on September 5th of that same year with Princess Diana. For a lot of us, she was a symbol of, a young format of the royalty, and she was doing so much humanitarian work. She felt like a voice of the people, kind of, and so when she died suddenly, tragically in a car crash like that, it was impactful.
We talked earlier about how Michael Jackson was always in the limelight. Princess Diana clearly was from the age 16 or whenever she got on Prince Charles's radar. She was in the limelight. And it was after a much publicized split with Prince Charles. Diana was determined to get on with her life and tried to separate herself from the now King of England. But she was never able to separate herself from the paparazzi, who ultimately led to the cause of that car crash. At least that's what my understanding is. That, of course, that was in Paris.
Yeah.
She was with her partner, Dodi Fayed, and their driver, Henry Paul, who lost control attempting to evade the paparazzi. I recall that evening or morning pretty well. In the States, it was a Saturday night. It was kind of late at night, maybe 9 or 10 when the news broke. I saw it on the television. It's interesting. You went up to see it on TV. I went down in my basement to get access to my computer, and I followed the news events on the BBC radio.
Oh, okay.
I followed it well into the more. I followed it. I don't know how many consecutive hours. I just couldn't take myself away from it. I remember telling my daughter, encouraging her to watch as much as she could, because I told her, I don't think, and I still believe this in my heart, in my lifetime, there will never be a person in their death that is as iconic worldwide as that of Princess Diana. I just can't imagine that.
Hmm.
And so the question is, why are we talking about it? So this is a podcast about music. A couple episodes ago, Jeremy, I published my 12 regrets. It was an episode I did on the artists that I regret not seeing in their prime, the performances. What were the most iconic performances in that I wish I would have seen?
Right.
By far the most, like, the one performance I wish I could have seen live was, I wish I was in that church with a couple thousand people when Elton John walked up on to the stage, got behind the piano, and with incredible composure, I do not know how he pulled it off, because he obviously was very close to Princess Diana, and did that performance of Goodbye, England's Rose.
I think what you just said, that's something, it's a bit of a recurring theme for me as a musician. How do musicians keep their composure in moments like that? I mean, I got to tell you, I've become teary-eyed just watching one of my school orchestras, and I'm conducting them and they just nail it, and it's in front of the parents and stuff, I can't imagine a close personal friend who you think extremely highly of dies and you have to go and sing a song. I don't know how he would have done that.
Yeah, I don't either. I've given a handful of eulogies. I don't think I've made a single eulogy without breaking down a bit. But obviously that song had rewritten lyrics by Bernie Taupin. It was the fastest selling single ever in the U.S. I think it was maybe the second fastest single in the UK.
It seems worth for me to mention, this recording was produced by Sir George Martin, who is, of course, the fifth Beatle in terms of creation of the Beatles' work. He also arranged the string quartet, the string parts that played during that recording, which I think is a beautiful strings arrangement. It's well worth going back and listening to it for those moments where the strings are in.
Good point. You said something earlier. You said something about you don't know how artists kind of keep it together when they perform, and how sometimes you get a little tear when you watch your students perform. I don't think, I'm going to talk about a song. Every time I hear it, I tear up.
Wow.
It's a song called Abraham, Martin, and John. It was written in 68. An American singer, Dion, recorded the song. It's a tribute to 4 assassinated Americans. I was not born when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. I'm old, but I'm not that old. The name of the song is called Abraham, Martin, and John.
It's amazing what you say, because I know quite a few people who have that with songs that they hear. There's a certain song that every time they hear it, for as long as it's been around, it hits them the same way. If it's okay with you, I would like to add in, you said as a Canadian and living in China, I might have a different perspective. There were a couple of things that were going through my mind as you said that. From the Canadian perspective, there are two people that went through my mind right away, plus a third afterwards. 2 Gordons. Gordon Lightfoot, only 2023 that it happened, very recently, but I remember I was on my way to work when I heard that news. Now, of course, the time difference is 12 or 13 hours different here, but I heard that news on the way to work, and when I got to work, I felt compelled to make a short video tribute to Gordon Lightfoot.
And this, of course, is our folk singing guest on today's show, Gordon Lightfoot.
First real good song sort of got me started in show business, or got me on to the next level. I'm on a rail with a dollar in my head. Songwriting is an extremely difficult gig. It takes a specific talent to do it. I've written now just over 400 songs, and it's hard on your mind, and you're obsessed with it, and you're driven to it. You're always just shooting for that ultimate quality of that perfect piece of material, that perfect poem.
Whatever will be said later will be said, be it good or be it bad, or both.
Sundown, you better take care if I find you've been creeping round my back. I didn't even know why necessarily I was doing it, but by that point I had started Our Mind on Music, and I just felt like this was something I had to commemorate in terms of, you know, my sadness of hearing that had happened, you know. So I made a video and posted that. The other one, when I was living in Kazakhstan, 2017, I heard about Gordon Downey, who was the singer of the Tragically Hip, who for a lot of Canadians is a very iconic band. He had been diagnosed with cancer, brain cancer, which very quickly took him from us. The band, the Tragically Hip, went on a national tour, and I remember the closing show of that tour. A few Canadians that were living in the area at the time got together, and for the entire show, not a dry eye in the house, you know, listening to songs that we have loved since the 80s, and to watch this guy that we knew we were going to lose very soon, and he died shortly after that last concert. As a Canadian, for me personally, those are moments that hit me a lot.
What was the highest grossing movie?
One of the reasons I think you and I started talking about this idea of this series was John Lennon. I was 8. It was 1980. It was December, the beginning of December 8th, 1980. I was 8 years old, but I remember my whole family was sitting around. My mom was on the couch, and my sisters and I were scattered around. I was lying on the floor in front of the fireplace, and there was a candlelight vigil being shown on City TV News. And I remember, as I tell you this, I can see that candlelight vigil and all the people crying, and my mom, my sisters all crying. 8 years old, and that is crystal clear in my memory. When we found out that John Lennon had died.
And we're going to do multiple segments under this title, "The Other Days That Music Died," and clearly John Lennon is going to be part of one of those segments. You brought up those artists for Northeast Ohio. It was Michael Stanley. You know, that's a name, you know, I've introduced you to some of his music, and Wally Trouble has has raved about Michael Stanley. The announcement, when that came out in Cleveland, the whole area, at least those that I would say from ages 40 to 80, we just kind of shut down. He had such an impact, not only because of his music, but he was everything Cleveland. He just was a blue-collar guy that worked hard and made a name for himself and never made it big nationally, but he always loved Cleveland, and his music and his lyrics spoke to what it was like to live in Cleveland. And I remember going to the vigil down at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There was a vigil for Michael Stanley, and I stood there. I guess there were maybe 400 or 500 fans on a very warm spring day, and they had a card there where you could write memories. They had oversized photo out in front of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame of Michael, and you could make notes. And the line for that, for people just to put their own message. I just started to think about it. Isn't it interesting how we get off on one topic and it just rolls into yet another? And
it is. The other thing that's interesting to me, Phil, is you didn't know, I think you didn't personally know Michael Stanley.
I met him, and he didn't know me from Shinola. That's correct.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it would be the same for Gordon Downey of the Tragically Hip. I never met him, but when he died, there was an impact that felt really personal. You know, especially where I was at that moment with a small group of Canadians sitting in Kazakhstan, of all places. It felt like this is one of our uniting forces, you know? So it felt like a really big thing, even though I didn't actually know the man, you know? I think I find that really interesting.
It's interesting. We fans think that we knew Michael. We all knew Michael. He was our friend, right? He didn't.
Yep.
Actually, I had 2 interactions with him. He was friendly, but he didn't know me from Shinola. And you know of Marc Lee Shannon, who I've introduced you to, played on 23 of Michael's albums, played with Michael for 20 years, and his impact on Mark's life was absolutely incredible. Mark had come out of rehab, had written a song, sent it to Michael the day he got out of rehab. He said, the email said Sauce Man. That was his nickname for Mark. You might want to hear this. And he had recorded a version of that song. And that was his gift.
Wow.
For turning his life around. The name of that song is called Sound of a Train.
Stars are out tonight, it's so amazing. And a big old empty house will drive you crazy. Lonely rooms will wrap their arms around you and spin you down to your knees. Outside everything is changing. Cool nights, autumn closing in. Think about